Hey, I'm Kate from Project Patterns, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draft this beautiful voluminous pair of trousers. It's for all of you out there who love the drama of a ball gown, a huge voluminous skirt, but also love the practicality of a pair of trousers. Before we get stuck in, I just wanted to remind you guys to like and subscribe if you are enjoying this video or any of my other tutorials. You will be the first ones to hear about the new videos that come out. You can also find me on Instagram, I'm at Project Patterns, and you can find all my online courses and loads of blog posts and all kinds of pattern cutting fun over on my website, www.project-patterns.co.uk. So, let's have a quick look at this design. We can see it's got loads of pleats, which is giving us all this volume, and you can see if I pull that apart that it is definitely a pair of trousers. All of our pleats go towards the front, so even from the back, they go away from the centre back towards the front and sweep around the body to create a little box pleat at the front there, at the front rise. I've also created a little waistband here. Now I'm not going to show you how to create a waistband because you should all be able to create just a simple rectangle, but I am going to show you how we can take our basic trouser block, here is my half scale trouser block, and how we can then add in loads of volume to create our giant pleated patterns. Now of course, I've done this in half scale, so I don't really need to think about my fabric width, but if you're doing this in full scale, you might find that once you slash all that volume in, your trouser pattern is slightly too big for the width of your fabric. If that is the case, just pop a seam in underneath your pleats. Kind of like we're going to do on the side seam. So you can see, you can't see any side seam from here, but it's hiding underneath inside our pleat. That's all you got to do in any of the other pleats if you need to put a seam somewhere in your pattern. For this style, I would add a centre back zip. I would do a invisible zip here, about 18 centimeters long, just so it's nice and discreet so you don't really see it. If you do it too long, you'll find that the zip tape will poke out at the bum here, which you don't want. So be really careful about the length that you use. This is a really fun design and it's super swishy and one that I know I would love to wear. So let's have a look at how we draft this. So starting from our half scale trouser block, the first thing I'm going to do is rotate my darts into my hem and convert them into fullness. Now to do this, I'm going to use a technique called pivoting, where I draw around part of my block, rotate it around and draw around the rest. So I'm going to rotate this dart into my hem position here, tracing around from that position of my grain line all the way up to my dart. Then I'm going to put my pen in the apex of my dart, rotate it closed. Then my hemline here, I'm just going to redraw. We're going to redraw this later on anyway, so we just want to do it roughly so that we have a measurement point. Then on my back, I'm going to do exactly the same. So here we have two darts. So if one, I'm going to rotate into this position here, the other, I'm going to rotate into this position here. Okay, lovely. So we have our front leg and our back leg. Now we also just want to straighten off our side seams slightly. You can see they're curving quite a lot. So what I'm going to do is at my hemline here, I'm going to add on 2 centimeters and then draw that up to my hip line. I'm going to do the same thing here on my back as well. Also just going to mark my hip position on here, just so I have it on there, and my knee position as well. Lovely. Okay. So now we have all of our volume rotated into our hem, we can start to think about slashing our pleats in there. Now on this trouser, we have a pleat that comes to the centre front here, and they both meet at the centre front. And then all the other pleats go this way as well, fanning out from it. On my front here, I want to have 3 pleats, not including my centre front one. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 on the front, and on the back, I'm going to have 1, 2, 3. Now on the back, we need to think about our dart underlay here because we don't really want our underlays overlapping at our centre back seam where our rise is. But for all the other ones, we can have our dart underlays overlapping our pleat next to it. So let's first mark in our pleat positions and then we can decide exactly how much we're going to add in. First thing I'm going to do is measure my waistline. 8.6 on my front and 8.5 on my back. Now the back's a little bit easier because we don't need to think about our front pleats, so we'll start there. Now 8.5 divided by 4, because that's how we get 3 points, gives me 2.12. So we'll round that to 2.1 and we'll just mark on some positions spaced at 2.1, measuring from the side seam or the centre back, doesn't really matter. Then to mark in where our pleats are going to hit our hemline, we're going to measure here and again divide that by 4. I get 33. So 33 divided by 4 gives me 8.25. So marking evenly spaced points spaced at 8.25. Then let's just draw in our pleat lines. So matching up the outermost points and then the middle points and then the innermost points. Great, so these are going to be our pleat lines. We can ignore this line here. Now for our front, it's a little bit different. So we have our pleat that's going to go somewhere here, but we don't really want the end of our pleat to hit the inside of our leg. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to draw it at about this angle so that we hit kind of the inner point of the calf, but not right in the middle of the leg. Then we can mark 3 evenly spaced points here and 3 evenly spaced points between our side seam and this line here. Again, this line we can ignore now. So we already know that that's 8.6. Let's measure the bottom. I get 18.5. So 8.6 divided by 4 gives me 2.15. And then 18.5 divided by 4 gives me 4.6. That means that here on my hem, I'm going to mark evenly spaced points 4.6 centimeters away from each other. And at the waist, I'm going to make evenly spaced points at 2.15 from each other. Beautiful. Okay, now let's just connect them up to mark our pleat positions. Great. So we have 3 pleats on the front plus our centre front one, and we have 3 pleats on the back. Now we also want to create a pleat on our side seam. We want our side seam to sit underneath the pleat. So in that crease that we have in the middle of our pleat, that's where our seam is going to be. So we're going to add half our pleat onto the front and half our pleat onto the back. So that means that our side seam here is going to end up being straight. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a line from this point up to our waist point here. I'm going to do that in a different colour for us as well. So from that new point where we added on, we're just going to go straight up to our side seam there. And it's okay that we lose this because we're going to add loads of volume through here. So we're not going to lose anything from our hip. Then I'm going to do exactly the same down here on my back. Okay, now let's think about how much volume we want to add in here. So for my pleat at my centre back here, we've already said that we don't want our pleat to overlap. So that means that we are restricted by how much underlay we want at the top. Now we said that this was 2.1 something. So what we'll do is our underlay here, when it's folded, will be 2 centimeters. The underlay will reach just about the centre back. That means in total, what we need to add in here is about 4 centimeters. I will add a little bit more through the hem than I do at the top, just so I get a nice flare on those pleats. Now if we're adding 4 centimeters here, I kind of want a little bit more through my other pleats. I want them to overlap slightly to really exaggerate that volume. So I think what I'll add into my other pleats is 6 centimeters in total. So we'll have a centimeter overlap, which means there'll be 3 centimeters when they're folded. So we'll add 6 here, 6 here, 6 here, 6 here, 6 here, and 6 here as well. Then at our side seam, we'll add the full pleat of 6 centimeters, but because we're adding half onto the front and half onto the back, we're just going to add 3 here and 3 here. So if our kind of average pleat width, or the one we've used the most, is 6 centimeters, and we said we want to add a little bit more through the hem, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 8 centimeters through all my hem points. So 8, 8, 8, 8, and we'll do 8 here and 8 here. And because we've added 4 up here, I'm going to add 6 down here just to keep that kind of flare proportional. And then on our sides, again, we are adding half, so we're going to add 4 and 4. Fabulous. Great, so now we know exactly how much we're adding. We can start to think about how we're going to add that in. Okay, so what I've got here is I've got my front leg cut out with all of my excess gone. Remember, we're using our stitch line because this is a block. Now what we can do is we can physically cut into all of these lines and stick paper in. If we do, we will end up with a pattern piece that looks something like this, where we have all these different layers of paper, and it's quite messy, right? So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this as a template, and I'm going to trace around it. Now because our slash lines are straight lines, we can do that. So we can kind of place it, trace around, mark on our pleat underlay, move it, trace around, repeat. Because our underlays are going to be uneven, so we're adding 6 at the top and 8 at the bottom, we can't just square our lines to create our underlay. So we're going to fold each pleat as we draft it to make sure that we're putting this back at the right angle. So I'm going to start from my side seam because all my pleats fold towards my center front. So here on my page, I've just drawn one long line, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to place my pattern piece here, getting that nice and flat, placing my straight line on my straight line, so my side seam on there. And then at my hemline here, I'm going to trace the first section of my pleat, or my visible area, making a mark where my first pleat cut line is. And then I'm going to do exactly the same at the waist here. So very carefully tracing that nice waist curve and that pleat position. And then I'm just going to join those up with a ruler. Then what we're going to do is add in our volume. So here at the top, we are adding 6 centimeters. So what we're going to do is add half of that first and then fold it to find out where our matching waist point is. So here I'm going to add 3 centimeters. And I'm going to square across from this point here and mark a little cross. And then at my hemline, I'm going to add 4 centimeters because we're adding 8 centimeters in total. And again, I'm going to square across and make a little cross. Then I'm going to fold my pleated edge here. Making sure that you get it nice and accurate on top of that line. And then I'm also going to fold it on the underneath line, so matching my crosses together. So from that point to that point there, keeping that nice and straight. And then when I take this like this, we can see we have a crease line here and a crease line here. And then if I fold that up, then this exact point here is where I want to start tracing my other waistline from. I'm also just going to follow my crease line up and draw myself a pleat line in there. And then when I open that up, you can see this is all of our pleat underlay, this is visible, and this is going to be visible. So if this is section number 1, this is section number 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm just going to pop number 2 on there, lining up that pleat line, because remember that was that pleat line there. So we have to line that one up there, and lining it up at the hem, and tracing across that nice curved waistline, marking in the next pleat line too. And then I'm just going to repeat what I did here to find my underlay and my matching point. And then when we get here, personally, I don't really like tracing around paper if you have a curved line like this. I think it's really inaccurate and it takes really long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut here and actually stick this onto my paper, and then I've got those lines on there. Alrighty, so this is our front with our volume added in. We still want to add onto our side seam though. Now remember, we said we're adding half of a pleat onto the side seam. So here, I'm going to go to the waist. I'm going to square 6 centimeters away. And at the hem, I'm going to square 4 centimeters away. Then instead of folding it, I'm just going to draw a line straight through those points, because we're going to grow the other half onto the back leg. Now we'll come back and do our underlays in a minute, but just so we don't get confused, this pleats to there, this pleats to there, this pleats to there, and this pleats to there. And we'll also come back and redraw our hem in a moment. First, let's go to our back and let's repeat this whole process on the back. All right, so here we are on the back. Now what I've done is exactly the same as on the front. I've taken my back pattern and I've trimmed off all my excess. That means that I can still use my waistline and my hem to trace over to create that same single piece of paper, rather than having all of those lots of layers in there when we slash and spread. But the difference here is that instead of starting from the side seam and going towards the centre back, we're going from the centre back towards the side seam, because all of our pleats are going around the body and meeting at the centre front. So what I've done is I've actually slashed up my first line here. So for this first pleat, we are going to kind of slash and spread a bit, kind of like we did on the front. I don't really enjoy tracing around paper very much for curves. I think it's really inaccurate, so I prefer to just pop my pattern on there and go from there. Chances are I'm probably going to trace it off anyway when I make my final pattern. So first things first, I'm going to take my centre back piece here and I'm going to stick that to my paper. And you can see that I'm sticking it relatively near the hem because we're going to fan up this way. Then let's think about adding that volume. We're going to do it in exactly the same way as we did for the front, except that here, remember, we're adding less. So we're adding 4 centimeters here and 6 centimeters here. So that means I'm going to mark 2 centimeters and 3 centimeters, and then we're going to fold it to get the other half. Okay, lovely. So Just to clear things up, again, this one goes to here, this one goes to here, and this one goes to here. Remember, at our side seam, we need to add half of a pleat width. So here, I'm gonna add 3 centimeters. And all I'm gonna do is just square that out for now, and we will get that lovely waist shape when we fold it closed. Okay, lovely. So my pieces are just slightly in screen. Any bigger would be off, but here we have all of our volume added in. Now we just want to think about finishing this off. So how we get the dart underlays, how we get the underlay and the shape for our side seam pleat, and then all we need to do is add seam allowance and twirl them up. So we already have our fold lines in here. If I just fold all of these closed, you can see that we then get our trouser leg. Now we're not going to worry about getting underlays for the pleats down here because they're going to be loose, they're not going to be stitched. So we'll just do them as a beautiful curved line. But here they need to be the correct underlay shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pin these down in place. Lovely. Okay, I'm going to do exactly the same on the back. Great. So putting these side by side, remember our back pleat is going over the front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold that pleat under, match it up with our side seam point there, and then pin that down in place too. It's exactly the same as all the other pleats. It just has a seam on the underlay. Then let's lift this up and just double check that our seam is in the same position. Yep, there we go. We can see they're sitting on top of each other. Lovely. And then all we need to do is pop some seam allowance onto that waist and we can trim all the way through. So I'm going to add 0.5 because this is half scale. Okay, so while this is all pinned down, we've got our seam allowance on there. What I'm going to do is trim through all of that there on the cut line so that we're getting all of our underlays through all the layers of paper there. Just trim that away slightly. And then you can see underneath on the back, we have all of our pleats here and all of our pleats here. And on our side seam pleat, we have this lovely shape here, which is what we want. Beautiful. Okay, so here you can see I've just got a little bit of paper stuck on there from before. I'm going to trim that off just to make things a little bit clearer for us. But we will need to add seam allowance on here and on here. So let's unpin this and we can see what those pleats look like. Finish off our hemline, add some seam allowance and create our waistband. So opening them up, you can see we've got our beautiful mountain shapes through there. And we have our side seam ones here. So let's just pop some seam allowance on here and then we can talk about our waistband and then we'll be ready to cut it out. I'm also just going to redraw my hemline. It's a lovely smooth curve. Alrighty, here she is all cut out with seam allowance on. I'm also going to put a little arrow here and a little arrow here, and I'm going to put a little A and circle that point and put a little A and circle that point to clearly indicate that this pleats over the seam onto A here. Now I also want to pop a grain line on here. I'm going to go for a grain line parallel to my inseam leg, so we've added all the volume out here. So if I add that parallel to the section below my knee, because I know on my block that that was straight. This is my grain line. Same thing here. This is my center back, this is my center front. And then of course you want to put your cut information on. This is my back leg, and it's cut 1 pair, self. This is my front leg, and it's also cut 1 pair, self. Okay, so you also just want to pop some notches on your pleat positions up there, and we want to create a waistband. Now I already know that my waist measurement for this block is 8.6 on the front and 8.5 on the back. So if I plus those together, times it by 2, then I have my measurement for my waistband. Great, let's cut this out and twirl it up. So this is what she looks like when she's twirled up. Super swishy, loads of volume. Now of course you could add even more volume if you wanted to. The volume that I chose to add is just an example. You could also change the direction of the pleats. Of course, I've done mine sweeping from the back all the way to the front. You could change them so that the front pleats go towards the front and the back ones go towards the back, and then you can put a pocket bag in, because the side seam here is a little tricky to reach. Kind of have to go in and back, it's a bit awkward. But in a nutshell, that is how we create a beautiful voluminous pair of ball gown trousers. Now, if you guys decide to give this a go, please do let me know. I would love to see what you achieve. And I also love to see what fabrics you use. I chose to use a lightweight fabric that has a bit of crispness, quite stiff, so it holds its own weight really well and creates more of that volume here. You could take that up a step further, and you could even add a little interlay or little tulle in here to really get that big bounce on the hip. You could do this in a totally different fabric. You could do it in something like a satin, which would drop, but also have that gorgeous swishy volume. I would genuinely love to see what you guys come up with. It's my favorite thing about pattern cutting, that it's creative and everyone has their own vision that they want to create. So if you want to share your work with me, you can find me on Instagram. I am at Project Patterns, or you can find me on my website, www.project-patterns.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye.